And we're going to continue with the second chapter of Mary Poppins Comes Back, Miss Andrew's Lark. We know that Miss Andrew is the name of Mr. Banks's old governess, who he said was a holy terror. She is coming to stay with the Bankses for a month, and where we last left off, we saw her taxi arrive just laden down with stuff, and we'll pick up from there.
"Make way, please! Make way! I'm coming out!" called the huge voice again. And at that moment there appeared on the step of the cab the largest foot the children had ever seen. It was followed by the rest of Miss Andrew. A large coat with a fur collar was wrapped about her, a man's felt hat was perched on her head, and from the hat floated a long gray veil. The children crept cautiously along the fence, gazing with interest at the huge figure, with its beaked nose, grim mouth, and small eyes that peered angrily from behind glasses. They were almost defeated by her voice as she argued with the taxi man. "4 and 3pence, she was saying. "Preposterous! I could go halfway around the world for that amount. I shan't pay it, and I shall report you to the police." The taxi man shrugged his shoulders. "That's the fare," he said calmly. "If you can read it on the meter. You can't go driving a taxi for love, you know, not with this luggage." Miss Andrews snorted, and diving her hand into her large pocket, took out a very small purse. She handed over a coin. The taxi man looked at it, turned it over in his hand, as if he thought it a curiosity. Then he laughed rudely. "This for the driver?" he remarked sarcastically. "Certainly not. It's your fare. I don't approve of tips," said Miss Andrew. "You wouldn't," said the taxi man, staring at her. And to himself he remarked, "Enough luggage to fill half the park, and she doesn't approve of tips, the harpy." But Miss Andrew did not hear him. The children had arrived at the gate, and she turned to greet them, her feet ringing on the pavement, and the veil flowing out behind her. "Well," she said gruffly, smiling a thin smile, "I don't suppose you know who I am."
"Oh, yes, we do," said Michael. He spoke in his friendliest voice, for he was very glad to meet Miss Andrew. "You're the Holy Terror." A dark purple flush rose up from Miss Andrew's neck and flooded her face. "You are a very rude, impertinent boy. I shall report you to your father." Michael looked surprised. "I didn't mean to be rude," he began. "It was Daddy who said—" "Tut! Silence! Don't dare to argue with me," said Miss Andrew. She turned to Jane. "And you're Jane, I suppose. I never cared for the name." "How do you do?" said Jane politely, but secretly thinking she did not care much for the name Euphemia. "That dress is much too short," trumpeted Miss Andrew. "And you ought to be wearing stockings. Little girls in my day never had bare legs. I shall speak to your mother." "I don't like stockings," said Jane. "I only wear them in the winter." "Don't be impudent. Children should be seen and not heard," said Miss Andrew. She leaned over the perambulator and with her huge hand pinched the twins' cheeks in greeting. John and Barbara began to cry. "Tut, tut, what manners!" exclaimed Miss Andrew. "Brimstone and treacle, that's what they need," she went on, turning to Mary Poppins. "No well-brought-up child cries like that. Brimstone and treacle, and plenty of it, don't forget." "Thank you, ma'am," said Mary Poppins with icy politeness, "but I bring the children up in my own way and take advice from nobody." Miss Andrews stared. She looked as if she could not believe her ears. Mary Poppins stared back, calm and unafraid. "Young woman," said Miss Andrew, drawing herself up, "you forget yourself. How dare you answer me like that? I shall take steps to have you removed from this establishment, mark my words." She flung open the gate and strode up the path, furiously swinging the circular object under the checked cloth and saying, "Tut, tut," over and over again. Miss Banks came running out to meet her. "Welcome, Miss Andrew, welcome," she said politely. "How kind of you to pay us a visit. Such an unexpected pleasure. I hope you had a good journey." "Most unpleasant. I never enjoy traveling," said Miss Andrew. She glanced with an angry peering eye round the garden. "Disgracefully untidy," she remarked disgustedly. "Take my advice, and dig up those things," she pointed at the sunflowers, "and plant evergreens.
Much less trouble. Saves time and money and looks neater. Better still, no garden at all, just a plain cement courtyard.
But, protested Mrs. Banks gently, I like flowers best.
Ridiculous! Stuff and nonsense! You're a silly woman, and your children are very rude, especially the boy.
Oh, Michael, I am surprised. Were you rude to Miss Andrew? You must apologize at once. Mrs. Banks was getting very nervous and flustered. No, Mother, I was only... he began to explain, but Miss Andrew's loud voice interrupted.
He was most insulting, she insisted. He must go to a boarding school at once, and the girl must have a governess. I shall choose one myself. And as for the young person you have looking after them, she nodded in the direction of Mary Poppins, you must dismiss her this instant. She is impertinent, incapable, and totally unreliable.
Mrs. Banks was plainly horrified. Oh, surely you're mistaken, Miss Andrew. We think she is such a treasure.
You know nothing about it. I am never mistaken. Dismiss her.
Miss Andrews swept on up the path. Mrs. Banks hurried behind her, looking very worried and upset. I hope we shall be able to make you comfortable, Miss Andrew, she said very politely, but she was beginning to feel rather doubtful.
It's not much of a house, replied Miss Andrew, and it's in a shocking condition. Peeling everywhere and most dilapidated. You must send for a carpenter. And when were these steps whitewashed? They are very dirty.
Mrs. Banks bit her lip. Miss Andrew was turning her lovely, comfortable house into something mean and shabby, and it made her feel very unhappy. I'll have them done tomorrow, she said meekly.
Why not today? Demanded Miss Andrew. No time like the present. And why paint your door white? Dark brown, that's the proper color for a door. Cheaper and doesn't show the dirt. Just look at those spots.
And putting down the circular object, she began to point out the marks on the front door.
There, everywhere. Most disreputable.
I'll see to it immediately, said Mrs. Banks faintly. Won't you come upstairs now to your room? Miss Andrews stamped into the hall after her.
I hope there's a fire in it.
Oh, yes, a good one. This way, Miss Andrew. Robertson will bring up your luggage.
Well, tell him to be careful. The trunks are full of medicine bottles. I have to take care of my health.
Miss Andrew moved toward the stairs. She glanced around the hall.
This wall needs repapering. I shall speak to George about it. And why, I should like to know, wasn't he here to meet me? Very rude of him. His manners, I see, have not improved.
The voice grew a little fainter as Miss Andrew followed Mrs. Banks upstairs. Far away, the children could hear their mother's gentle voice, meekly agreeing to do whatever Miss Andrew wished. Michael turned to Jane. Who's George? He asked her. Daddy, but his name is Mr. Banks. Yes, but his other name is George. Michael sighed. A month is an awfully long time, Jane, isn't it? Yes, 4 weeks and a bit, said Jane, feeling that a month with Miss Andrew would seem more like a year. Michael edged closer to her. I say, he began in an anxious whisper. She can't really make them send Mary Poppins away, can she? No, I don't think so, but she's very odd. I don't wonder Daddy went out.
Odd?
The words sounded behind them like an explosion. They turned. Mary Poppins was gazing after Miss Andrew with a look that could have killed her. Odd, she repeated with a half-drawn sniff. That's not the word for her. Humph. I don't know how to bring up children, don't I? I'm impertinent, incapable, and totally unreliable, am I? We'll see about that. Jane and Michael were used to threats from Mary Poppins, but today there was a note in her voice they had never heard before. They stared at her in silence, wondering what was going to happen. A tiny sound, partly a sigh and partly a whistle, fell in the air. What was that? Said Jane quickly. The sound came again, a little louder this time. Mary Poppins cocked her head and listened. Again, a faint chirruping seemed to come from the doorstep. Ah! Cried Mary Poppins triumphantly. I might have known it. And with a sudden movement she sprang at the circular object Miss Andrew had left behind and tweaked off the cover. Beneath it was a brass bird cage, very neat and shiny. And sitting at one end of the perch, huddled between his wings, was a small light brown bird. He blinked a little as the afternoon light streamed down upon his head. Then he gazed solemnly about him with a round dark eye. His glance fell upon Mary Poppins, and with a start of recognition he opened his beak and gave a sad, throaty little cheep. Jane and Michael had never heard such a miserable sound. "Did she indeed? You don't say," said Mary Poppins, nodding her head sympathetically. "Chirp, chirrup," said the bird, shrugging its wings dejectedly. "What, 2 years? In that cage? Shame on her!" said Mary Poppins to the bird, her face flushing with anger. The children stared. The bird was speaking in no language they knew, and yet here was Mary Poppins carrying on an intelligent conversation with him, as though she understood. "What is it saying?" Michael began. "Shh!" said Jane, pinching his arm to make him keep quiet. They stared at the bird in silence. Presently he hopped a little way along the perch toward Mary Poppins and sang a note or two in a low, questioning voice. Mary Poppins nodded. "Yes, of course I know that field. Was that where she caught you?" The bird nodded. Then he sang a quick, trilling phrase that sounded like a question. Mary Poppins thought for a moment. "Well," she said, "it's not very far. You could do it in about an hour, flying south from here." The bird seemed pleased. He danced a little on his perch and flapped his wings excitedly. Then his song broke out again, a stream of round, clear notes, as he looked imploringly at Mary Poppins. She turned her head and glanced cautiously up the stairs. "Will I? What do you think? Didn't you hear her call me a young person? Me?" She sniffed disgustedly. The bird's shoulders shook as though he were laughing. Mary Poppins bent down. "What are you going to do, Mary Poppins?" cried Michael, unable to contain himself any longer. "What kind of a bird is that?" "A lark," said Mary Poppins, briefly turning the handle of the little door. "You're seeing a lark in a cage for the first time. And the last." And as she said that, the door of the cage swung open. The lark, flapping his wings, swooped out with a shrill cry and alighted on Mary Poppins' shoulder. "Humph," she said, turning her head. "That's an improvement, I should think." "Chirrup," agreed the lark, nodding. "Well, you'd better be off," Mary Poppins warned him. "She'll be back in a minute." At that, the lark burst into a stream of running notes, flicking its wings at her and bowing its head again and again. "There, there," said Mary Poppins gruffly. "Don't thank me. I was glad to do it.